Hello, welcome back to the Under God Project podcast. We're excited to have you with us again today.
Absolutely, it's been a long time, everybody. It's been a long time. So here we got a really great show for you today. I'm super excited with the guests that we have. So I've got my little intro, as you guys know, just to keep things succinct. So God makes families, families make nations. Welcome to the Under God Project podcast. Together, we accelerate America to be one nation under God again. Looking for courage is the theme for today. Today we're exploring how the courage of one family changed our nation generation after generation. We're premiering this episode just a few days after we filmed it, and as you guys kind of know, if you watched this before, we film it as though it's live. We've got our little buttons, we push things on, and we trip over our own media. But then we premiered a couple of days later. The reason for that is that this means that we can answer questions live on the chat. Okay, so say hi, future me, whatever. So we should be on YouTube, Facebook, maybe a few more, stuff like that. But today we actually have a very special treat because our guest should be available to answer questions with us. So that will be really great. We want to encourage you to ask your questions as you have them. Say hello. We're going to be talking about some really cool stuff, and it's going to be great. As always, be kind, be respectful. But for those who are new to Under God Project, now is the time for this generation of families to secure the liberty of the next generation by courageously declaring that we are one nation under God. God has made your family, and America is only what our families make it to be. If you have not already, sign up, gather the family, complete your compact experience. It is a blast. It's so much fun, and it is truly meaningful in a variety of ways. There are new ways to transact on with the experience, new products in the store. So explore, find what works for you, find out what you guys like, and have fun with it. So let's get into our subject. So for today, as a founding family, the Lees of Virginia had the only two brothers to sign the Declaration of Independence. Super cool. Boldly proposed the Resolution of Independence in Congress, and so much more. So this family actually paid their pledge of their lives, their fortunes, and sacred honor to one another in the service of liberty for all, generation after generation. Today we are honored to discuss this heritage of courage with a living descendant of the Lees of Virginia. Let me introduce my friend, Steve Remmel. So let's get him, there we go. Steve is a good friend of mine. How you doing, Steve?
Doing great. Really, really happy to be here.
Yeah, we've been nerding out for weeks about this conversation, so we're really excited to have it. Steve, do you want to tell the story of how we met and how we bumped into each other?
Sure. Yeah. It's a classic case of sitting down next to the right person on an airplane, right? We've all done that. Sat next to people. Had a good conversation here or there. Well, this conversation that we had just went even further, and we connected about American history and about our businesses and our families. And next thing you know, Andy and I are corresponding and doing business together, and now it's led to this podcast. So just when you have those great conversations on airplanes, it's a blessing when it continues beyond the plane ride.
Absolutely, yeah. I knew Steve was awesome when he said that he was the first member of his family not to go to West Point since it began. And I was like, wait, that's like 1600. Like, that's a long time ago. He says, yep. And he's like, I'm related to the Lees. Whoa, holy cow. Like, let's jump in. So, it's been great. But before we jump in, though, to the history and the heritage and the stories and all that stuff, I want to tell our audience about Legal Shield. So Steve is my representative of Legal Shield. We have it for my family, for all of our businesses. We actually use it all the time. I use it mostly for questions. I think I'm bugging the lawyers on the other side because I call them up about Texas, about Tennessee, and about just about any state that we're running through, and they're very helpful. They're very friendly. We, as you guys know, we go from state to state a lot. And it's great to have a representative and advocate, especially as you travel. So, Steve, what got you into Legal Shield? What can you tell us about it?
Well, I saw this as an employee benefit at my last employer. And so I went out on my own as a consultant about 10 years ago. I realized that this was something that people needed to know about, that I needed it, that everybody that I knew needed it, because we're a nation of laws. We're governed by laws, but most of us don't know the laws we're governed by. And so if you don't know your rights, you don't have any rights. That's just how it works in America. And lawyers really are our conduit. They're our access to knowing what our rights are so we can make good decisions. And identity theft is a crime where you're actually guilty and you have to prove your innocence. And so Legal Shield provides justice and security for individuals, families, business owners, if you just heard Andy say, because it gives access, affordable access to attorneys and to identity theft protection, which really everybody needs. So for the last 10 years, I have had the joy of working with all kinds of people all across the country and Canada, benefits brokers, individuals, families, business owners, to provide protection and security. And I just really enjoy empowering people. And my wife has had this, I think, 20 years. I've had it 10 years, and it's just been a blessing for us, both financially, but also personally.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's been really beneficial for us. Let's go ahead and put that up there, guys. Give Steve a call. And
yeah, text me, call me, email me, whatever works. Yeah, happy to share information and just education. It's really about education. A lot of people don't know this exists, and for $1 a day, to have access to a law firm seems a little strange until you understand how it works and why it works.
Yeah, it does. Again, it's very affordable. It's great value. We've really enjoyed it. I probably use it way too much. They know me when I call.
It's unlimited access.
It's unlimited access.
Okay.
It's unlimited access.
I'm not gonna fire you.
Right. But you're absolutely right. If you don't know your rights, then how can you use them, right? If you don't know your rights, then you don't have them. And so when you go, we are a country of many states, and therefore there's many books of laws. And that's really a part of what this conversation is about. It's not just a plug for my friend's business, but we are a country of laws and different states that have different books of laws. And so it's really wise to get to know them, and access to them is very important. So anyway, we appreciate the service that Legal Shield offers us.
It's part of being free in America. Right on the Supreme Court building, is the statement, that we're all equal. We have equal access, but we did access, but we're equal. But if you don't have access, then how can you really exercise your rights? And so this all fits in actually with this larger theme we're talking about. This idea that we have the inalienable freedoms and rights, and it is the societal structure that we're in that it determines how much that's actually true in practice. And that is where Legal Shield comes in, but it also comes back to why the nation was formed in the first place. We as a set of colonies, the people in the colonies were not being treated fairly by the structures being imposed on them, specifically financial. And so it led to a desire to exercise their freedom to break away and form their own country. Yep. And that's the foundational reason why we're even talking about this at all. It's the only reason that Legal Shield can even exist at all, too.
Absolutely. That's totally not lost on me. So, I just want to put this is my shameless plug, okay? So we actually have t-shirts that we made for this conversation. It says, sweetheart, what does that say from there?
It says, "It takes a courageous family," quoting the Lee Resolution from June 7th, 1776.
And our camera just killed on us, so you're going to watch us do this on the fly. So,
but it's a great shirt. It really is. I want one. I really want one.
So yeah, it says it takes a courageous family, and then the Lee Resolution, June 7th, 1776. So let's start with that. Let's start with June 7th, 1776.
Well, we just had our anniversary of it, obviously, not very long ago. So it's good to bring that up and talk about what June 7th means to America and why that's important today.
Yep. So, Steve, I'm going to let you introduce what the Lee Resolution is.
So Richard Henry Lee who introduced on June 7th a formal resolution that which was very well thought out. If you read it, it's very well constructed. This was not something he did the night before. This has been coming for a while, right? The issues of taxation have been going on for quite a while. Many of us are aware of that, I think. Hopefully, that really for about a 10-year period, there was tension and issues. We've heard of the Boston Tea Party as an example of an event that occurred in that 10 years, right? And so on June 7th, Richard Henry Lee proposed to the Continental Congress that the formal declaration that we should be that colonies should be free states, free and separate from the crown. That was a huge thing, because in the history of the world, it is not an exaggeration to say, in the history of the world, and certainly in the history of the British Empire, which at that time was the most powerful nation in the world, the largest navy, the largest army, I mean, the most money, they were all over the world. No one had ever had the audacity to say, we're breaking away from you. We're not going to be a part of you. We're going to be our own thing. As a country, forming a country, people had never formed a country in this of the world. Countries had always been formed by monarchs or lords or despots, or, you just go back through it, whether it's in Asia or anywhere, right? People never formed a country. No group of people got together and formed a country. And that's what this resolution was saying, was that we, the people of these colonies, should be independent states and form our own country and be free of the crown. And that event, it's interesting, June 7th kind of comes and goes, and we don't light any fireworks or have any holidays around it, but that had to be proposed and then refined and debated, which led eventually to what we do celebrate, which is the signing of the Declaration on July 4th. But July 4th, a lot happened from June 7th to July 4th. It had to, because this was such a big thing, and there was no playbook, right? I mean, Richard Henry Lee introduced this. It needed massaging, it needed work, it needed debate. There was huge risk. We take it for granted that this worked. Nobody knew that this was going to work. The British could have come over here and stamped out everybody and killed off everybody who tried to rebel, and that would have been the end of that, and we would have never even remembered June 7th. So, the fact that these pictures you're seeing here exist was not a given. This was the courage, Andy, that you were talking about earlier. This took a lot of courage, because they knew they were starting a fight that the odds said they were not going to win, but they had faith, they had conviction, they had belief, and they had need. They felt the need to do it. They didn't feel they had any other choice, and that's powerful.
That is. So let's start with this, and then we're going to jump into the family. So Richard Henry Lee on June 7th declares independence. I keep thinking there's different verbiage to use. It's not like he proposed and was like, hey guys, I think this might be a good idea, but listen to the words that he says. It's resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. I wish I had this on the thing, but it's not there. That they are absolved from all allegiances to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. So it goes on two more. It says that it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. So we'll get into the nerdiness of that in a little bit. But essentially, that's the Declaration of Independence before the Declaration of Independence. At June 11th, that's when the committee is formed with Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and those guys to say, okay, now let's write down all the reasons and let's really open it up. But resolved that these united colonies are not to, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. That's the Declaration of Independence spoken of at the Second Continental Congress by Richard Henry Lee. And it's an honor and it is an honor to sit with a descendant and talk about it. So let's talk about the family a little bit. So let's go into do you want to
bring up the tree so we can talk about that?
Do you want to talk about the tree, or do you want to do this one first? There's a lot of Lees.
Well, okay. If you bring this up though, you have to, from here on out, almost every time you say the word Lee, you have to enunciate
it. You have to enunciate the word Lee. That might get a little old after a while, but yes, certainly, right?
It's a big family. It is a big family.
Family.
And today there are many, many cousins of the Lee family as a
Yes.
result. Yeah. There you go. There's the core tree right there.
Yeah. So
So
we get
Richard Henry Lee didn't actually have any children, so I don't even think I'm a direct descendant of him.
Oh,
But
okay. Yeah.
yeah, but many others did, including Robert E. Lee and his father Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, who fought in the Revolutionary War as a young man. And so this is not actually a complete tree, but this gives a snapshot of a couple generations, a few generations of Lees, and you can picture there's generations actually above this, and then certainly many generations below this fanning out. And there are many cousins of the Lee family, and the Society of the Lees of Virginia was formed over 100 years ago to try to bring all those descendants together into one place, if you will, into one society, so we can celebrate our heritage of the Lees, because the family is so important for the formation of this country.
Yeah, exactly. What I like about this image is it does kind of show some of the big ones. So Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee, these are the only brothers to sign the Declaration of Independence together. Eventually,
Every time.
sorry. Eventually, the Richard Henry Lee, after they put together the Articles of Confederation, he becomes the president of the Congress, of the Continental Congress, after independence. So technically the first president of the United States, but we didn't have the Constitution then. So I guess you could say he was it before it was cool, I guess. But so he's the president of the Continental Congress, and then they have the Constitutional Convention where they create the Bill of Rights and what the role of government is going to be. And so he's there. He and Francis Lightfoot Lee, they both have differing opinions as to, even though they were together on everything else, they even protested in Congress together and etc. They actually had different opinions about how the federal government was going to be put together, whether it was more federalism or whether it was more liberty centric. And so the brothers kind of conflicted on that. Even though they were together on just about everything else. And so they both architected the Bill of Rights, and that was one of the things that Richard Henry Lee was insisting that they have, because he wanted limited government. And then we go all the way down, and generations later, we have Robert E. Lee. Now you can see here that we have Harry Lighthorse, Lighthorse Harry Lee. I get him confused. Who fought as well in War of 1812? Is that right?
Well, he fought in the Revolution.
That's right.
He fought in the
Yeah, you
Revolution.
had mentioned that earlier. Good. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then after the Revolution was over, he eventually was the father of who we now know as Robert E. Lee. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So we have Richard Henry Lee, and we've had this conversation like 5 or 6 times already. So I'm kind of like going, okay, let's bring everybody to where we've been. So
well, we had talked about how with Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee, how both of them combined, along with the rest of Congress, they inspired everyone else to be able to fight for the revolution. So they got the courage from the Congress in order to fight against Europe and the British Navy. And I mean, think about how outnumbered they were. Congress themselves weren't able to fight necessarily because, I mean,
right.
They're older, so give them a break, sure, whatever. But they encouraged their family members, they encouraged all of the people who wanted their freedom to fight in the American Revolution. And I think that was what the armies really needed, because I know Washington at the time was even struggling, and their troops were depleting, if you remember correctly.
Yep.
When they were drafting the Declaration of Independence, there was a lot of turmoil and issues.
Well, lack of everything, lack of food, lack of money.
Exactly.
People to fight. And the signers really did fight. I mean, they defended their homes. I mean, some of them lost their homes, lost their fortunes, defending their families. They each kind of fought in different ways, and as things tend to go in this world, it was not equally shared among all of them in terms of what they lost. Some lost more than others. The Lees were able to keep Stratford Hall, was never captured. The British did try, and they were actually repelled back by Richard Henry Lee and Ladros Lee, Whitford Lee. But yes, it was definitely an act of courage, that signing of Declaration of Independence, and it fortunately led enough people to sign up and fight under Washington, and enough of the population, not very many, but enough of the population to support them. And the French came along too. Without the French, not sure how it would have all been pulled off. And the combination of all of that eventually led, in 1887 or 1881 to the end of the war.
Right. So the Lee family to me is really great, because this family, like the Lees, had amassed a massive fortune through generations back. Richard I came. He was a self-made man, but he still came and started the tobacco plantation and had amassed this massive wealth. But they had the Lees were everywhere. Like you had Lees in the House of Burgesses. Richard Henry Lee started there. Lightfoot Lee was now in Continental Congress, and then you had other Lees. But tell me about the other Lees that existed. Who else do we have?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, they're for the founding family of the Commonwealth of Virginia, which was the largest and most wealthy colony, for sure. There were four brothers in that generation during the Revolutionary War. Four brothers. We talked about two of them. The other two were in England. So William and Arthur were in England, and they supported the revolution. They supported their brothers. They supported the American cause. Imagine doing that, but you're in England. You're in the place where you're trying to break away from. Pretty dicey, right? So they had to keep some of their activities anonymous or clandestine. Eventually, at the right before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Continental Congress asked Arthur to go abroad. He went to France. He eventually met with King Louis and persuaded him to send military to support the revolution. William went to Berlin and Vienna. This was a start of us as a country having foreign alliances to help us be stronger. And without those alliances, it's hard to say if we would have pulled it off, because we were up against the largest and most powerful country in the world. And of course, France and Germany and Austria, they had some reason to listen to us, right? Because they had their issues with Britain.
Right.
So it worked out well for us. Yeah. But the Lee family was instrumental in all of that support, which was instrumental in us eventually winning the war.
Yeah. So I think it's just really exciting, because we've got, I think Benjamin Franklin is very well known for his ambassadorship through France and with others, but to have Arthur Lee and William Lee there as well, in one way. So William is in. They
were first.
Yeah,
they were well. Yeah. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, what they did abroad came later, but at that pivotal point, I mean, picture it. It's June, right? This looks like this is going to be happening, and Arthur and William were over there doing things to support. For instance, the Battle of Concord, the Battle of Lexington. They were instrumental in shaping opinion over in England about that. There were people in England that thought that this is a good thing, and they helped shape that. And then they went abroad and did the work they did. So that's just part of that Lee family history that's sort of lost, which is kind of why we're here, right, for this podcast. Sort of like make people aware of all of this, and all this really came out of Stratford Hall, which you can still visit today. It's amazing how that's still possible.
Yeah. So Stratford.
I was just there last year at this time, and it's been restored, and it is the Mount Vernon, I would say, is a Mount Vernon and Stratford Hall, Monticello. I'm forgetting one or two, but that's it. It's a pretty short list of houses that represent families that were so instrumental in the Revolution and in the founding of this country. And Stratford Hall has been amazingly restored, and the history there is deep. And you really get a sense for the Lee family and what they meant to the country both before and after the Revolution.
Well, that's exactly. I'm trying to think so Richard Henry Lee is, I think, is a really interesting character because he's extremely active. So he's
Yes.
he's in the House of Burgesses really early on in his, I don't want to say his childhood, but really early on in his career. And the House of Burgesses, the way that the governments work, just for those who don't know, the way that the government works is there's each state has its own legislative body. So it's true that the states create the federal government, not the other way around. It's not governments that create governments. It's the state that creates the states create governments, and people create their states. And so we know that, again, God makes families, families make nations. Families create the counties that we're in, a lot of the borders that we have between states. Those are all, a lot of them are religious borders. Because I tithe differently, I tax differently. The way that laws work on in your personal life is different from state to state. So Richard Henry Lee is young. He's in the House of Burgesses. He has some moments where he's able to speak up and have kind of like, and then he goes through the House of Burgesses, and then he's into the Continental Congress, right? And he's discussing.
Well, but before that, 1765, he proposed the first formal resolution against British taxation.
Oh yeah,
right. Yeah. So the Leestown resolves. I'm actually reading from a picture of a placard at Stratford Hall that I took myself last year. So in Westmoreland County in Virginia, he appealed to the men. Essentially, then it was men, because that's how the things worked in terms of taxation and land ownership. But the people of Westmoreland County, he threatened danger and disgrace to citizens who paid the stamp tax. So he was very fiery, right? I mean, that's a pretty bold thing to say, right? Is that you, my fellow colonists, we're going to punish you if you support the stamp tax from the British that we think's illegal. We need to fight it. And that was all written down and proposed, and it was adopted. That was 1765. Wow. And that's the first documented event of protest against taxation by the British government. And from that, we now can connect the dots forward and see that eventually that led to the resolution that Henry Lee proposed on June 7th. That we've already discussed. So, a lot happened between now and then, between those two events. But that it all started in Virginia, and it was really led by a Lee.
Exactly. So exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
you can't have too much fun with that. That's scary.
I know. It's yeah. It's not the Westmoreland Resolution. Is not what it's called. It's called something else, right? What was it?
Yeah, Leestown. The Leestown resolves.
The
Leestown resolves.
Leestown resolves, exactly. So this is in response to the This is in response to the Stamp Act, and the Stamp Act is pretty much the British king saying anything that has to do with paper we're gonna tax. Right, so if you're exchanging anything that has to do with paper, which is a complete, like, how are you going to live, and so I mean but the Lees, Richard Henry Lee is the architect of actually wrote the resolution there. Now this is somebody who had amassed a big fortune and was very active, had every reason to just go with the flow, had every reason to just stay with the king, because he's like, why would I have to? I'm very wealthy. I've lived a great lifestyle this way. Why should I go against the king? Why should I protest? And the fact of the matter is he was driven he wanted liberty for all, right? He believed in the things that, even though there was conflict there, he believed in the reasons that they would eventually write in the Declaration of Independence, which tyrants are bad, liberty comes from us individually, and liberty is good.
Individually.
Very good. And so, creating the impetus of our independence and with the Lee Resolution in 1770, or June 7th, 1776, and then that's voted on July 2nd. And then the Declaration of Independence is signed on July 4th. So
Right.
our celebration of July 4th, 1776, our celebration of July 4th is when the Declaration was signed. But as you said, the proposal starts on June 7th, and then goes to I mean, we went from no nation to a new nation in less than 30 days. That's actually quite fast. So especially the way that Congress works today, that's actually quite fast to create a whole new
Way
nation
fast
in 30
today.
days.
Yes. Yeah, and we weren't actually even called a nation. It was just a country. We were just forming a
Right.
country of united of the independent but United States. So it was just the United States of America. Yeah, and you're right. Of course, Thomas Jefferson and I mean, there was many people collaborating on that. They all in their debating. It's very clear. If you see the play Hamilton, you can see a lot of this play out. Where just by the debating and the discussion they had, it cemented their ideas of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That
Mhm.
the inalienable rights that we are given by God, that no tyrant should be able to take away or limit. And that's just a very unique concept. There's really no one else, as I said earlier, no other group of people in the history of the world had ever done that against any tyrant. Not in Europe, not in Asia, nowhere. And so it's just an amazing thing. And the Lees, just because they had a lot of influence and they were larger than probably think any other family involved in the revolution. They had a lot to do with what happened after that. And it's just important. It's interesting how it's like, why are we talking about this today? Well, part of the reason we're talking about this today is because most people have no idea. When we say the Lee family, what do most people think? They think of Robert E. Lee, who led the Confederate forces, who lost in the Civil War. Well, because he was on the losing side of the Civil War, and after that, Lee sort of went a little quiet, if you will, because that's what happens when you're on the losing side of things. That therefore, a lot of this history we're talking about today has somewhat been lost. And yet there's a rich history. We're talking about here about from 1765 to 1865. That's 100 years if you start with the demarcation point of those Leestown resolves and go all the way to the end of the Civil War. That's 100 years of Lee's being very involved in the formation of this new country. And it's really not taught. And I know about it because my grandmother told me, "You're a Lee. This is what it means to be a Lee." And my mother told me, "You're a Lee. This is what it means to be a Lee," from her perspective. And it wasn't just, "Oh, you're a descendant of Robert E. Lee." It was you're a Lee, the Lees of Virginia, right? I was told you have two relatives. You're descended from two men who signed the Declaration of Independence. I was like, oh wow, So I kind of grew up with this around the dinner table, you know, and and so I feel privileged that I had that sort of education, even though it was fairly light. We didn't have like big sessions. It wasn't homeschooling with books and charts and everything. It was just talked about. It was understood. And my godfather was a Lee. He was also a general in Vietnam, and he was a Lee and I would sit with him and we would talk about the military and about West Point and I learned about the formation of West Point and I learned about my grandfather on my father's side or excuse me my grandfather on my mother's side, the non-Lee side, the Coulter side, who went to West Point and he fought under MacArthur. You sort of learn this history, and I feel privileged that was all just part of our normal family conversation. So I had a larger sense of me as part of a family tree that wasn't just my immediate family. And so when I went to college, I guess it's no surprise that I gravitated towards being a history major. And I studied not just American history, but European history, Asian history. But I sort of had this sense of history the fact that I was shared with me that I was part of a larger family that had had a historical impact that affected where I was living today and the country I was living in today, and all the people that I knew were affected by what my family had done generations before, not just Robert E. Lee.
Right. Well, absolutely. Right. And that's so. Let's see. Before we get before we get through, so the Lees are just this massively this massive family that is just super important because we go all the way back to again the forming of our nation and the Richard Henry Lee is the president of the Continental Congress after under the Articles of Confederation, and yet creates, again, we create the Constitution, the Bill of Rights part of his influence and under his direction, and that's what we have today. And then generations later, we have Robert Ely as well. And so, before we get into Robert Ely, what more do we want to talk about with with Richard Henry Lee? Do we want to? Let's see.
I think it's important to bring up the topic of slavery and
Okay.
enslaved people. If you, and again, Hamilton is a great play to go to understand some of this tension that occurred as the country was being formed. These men are talking about unalienable rights and equality, and yet many of them own slaves. And they
Right.
own enslaved people. I'm trying to change my language on this. Enslaved people, they were people, and there's a tension there. And the Lees, as I understand it, Richard Henry Lee and Lightfoot Lee, also known as Frank, they understood that conflict, and in a perfect world, that conflict would have been resolved with the formation of the country. We know that it wasn't. They just didn't have the votes. This was a process, right? None of the colonies had to go along with this. Any one of them could have said, "No, we're out," and we couldn't have that. There was only 13 of them.
Right.
We needed everyone. We're going up against the British Empire here.
Right.
So there's a tension there. When you, just like today, and when we're passing laws, if you need the votes, sometimes you got to make the compromises to get the votes. Otherwise, you're not going to get what you want. And it was no different. So not enough Southern plantation owners in the other colonies were willing to free their slaves and say, okay, yes, we're going to actually make this statement of equality true for every male, at least, in the country, because that's how they thought of it at the time. And so the Lees were sort of conflicted there, but it kind of went along with it. And as so many did, then they continued to own slaves because enslaved people, because they already had them, and they just kind of went along with it. And that's obviously what led eventually to the Civil War, needed to sort of to resolve all that. And the Lees were just caught up in that, along with many other influential families and leaders. And we just have to acknowledge, these are not perfect people. We put them on pedestals and we say how wonderful their leadership and their courage and all these things, and all of that is very, very true. That did not make them perfect. And certainly, I think the issue of slavery proves that these were men and women who struggled, did their best. We might wish they had done it differently, but we're speaking from our time now in the 21st century. You can't project that on to people in previous centuries and years, and it's just the way that it is. And we just have to kind of acknowledge that. When I was at Stratford Hall, I was pleased to see that there was a tour, a self-guided tour from the perspective of the enslaved people that lived there. There was a tremendous amount of research and genealogy and history and archaeological work that's been done to understand who were all of the people that lived at Stratford Hall, not just the Lee family, but the people that worked there, the people that were enslaved there, who also worked there. What did that mean? They were a community, they were a broader family running that plantation. And just understanding all of that, it gave me a sense for the complexities of the concept of slavery. It's not just, well, these people enslaved these people. These were relationships, and it went over generations, and there were names that were shared. I mean, lots of nuances that if anybody has roots and has studied their roots coming from enslaved family or those that would enslave others, that there's many different aspects of it, and it just sort of makes up who America is. And then the Civil War, really sort of was needed to eventually get that over the line, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that it's really interesting. Richard Henry Lee was such a strong voice for liberty. He was such a strong voice for liberty for all. In his maiden speech, he condemns right away. In his maiden speech in the House of Burgesses, he condemns slavery. Right, the act of owning people. He calls it out and says this is insidious. We should not be continuing this. But it takes more than it's like an all or nothing thing, right? It has to go away, right? And so I see him on the freedom side of things when the Declaration of Independence is put together. They go through a few drafts of the Declaration of Independence. You can see that Thomas Jefferson, when he's done with it at first, and you guys remember the movie 1776? It's this musical, right? In the musical, like I think we saw this the other day when we were watching with our kids, when we were kind of doing our unit study with our kids.
Fair warning: don't watch with your kids.
Yeah, that one. There's a lot of there's a lot of innuendo. There's a lot of adult humor. Let me put it that way.
Yes, most of the time they won't catch it, but there are those things that you're like, oh, that was too close for comfort.
It's too close. But I think it actually portrays it kind of well. Is just that, the original intention of the Declaration of Independence is to declare that all people are free, right? They were serious about the tenets that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator certain inalienable rights, and of these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they meant everybody. However, the big however is that they were participating in slavery, right, at the time. And so they couldn't have both. If they didn't bring all of the states along, then it would fall apart, and they needed independence first. And so then the next part would have to come later, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
so
yeah, it's true. I mean, Thomas Jefferson owned some slaves. We know that, even though he was advocating for this, just as Henry Lee was. And I mean, a great example to me is you go to Mount Vernon. George Washington, he owned enslaved people. So did his wife, right, Martha. Now he could control this. He could control what happened to him after he died. So he put in his will that when he died, all of his enslaved people were free. And in fact, that's what happened. They were free. His wife handled it differently, and they were not free, and they were sold off. So people ended up having to make their own individual choices about because it wasn't able to be addressed at that larger level the way that you're describing.
Right, exactly.
It was emotional. It was difficult. There was fiery debate. People felt strongly. Henry Lee felt strongly. Thomas Jefferson felt strongly. And yet, again, at the end of the day, they just didn't have the votes. Right. They just didn't have the support. You couldn't pull this off unless all 13 colonies joined up and said, we're doing this. And they couldn't get that and the abolition of slavery at the same time. And they had to make a call. And so they essentially kicked it down the road to the next generation to figure out, which we know eventually led to the Civil War.
It's interesting. I was just looking at one of the delegates I think it was for South Carolina, one that was for maintaining enslaved people, right? Like for maintaining slavery. And it's interesting because his family, like his wife and his I think his son-in-law, etc., they become some of the more revered abolitionists, right? And he ends up only with one enslaved person in his estate by the time he passes away. And so it's interesting how it's not always there all of the time, right? And it's very interesting.
It's very nuanced.
Yes, it is. It
very
gets
nuanced.
very
nuanced.
George
Washington and Martha.
Yes,
it's crazy.
It's not all just there all the time. Even for those that were seeking to keep it, right? They're seeking to maintain it. Thinking that it was, that it wasn't an evil. That's not the way they felt all the time, and that's not the way that it ended up, even in their own individual. So it's almost like the timing of everything had what wasn't perfected, but eventually. So then we lead up.
We're close. Sorry, good.
Then we lead up to the events that occur in the Civil War, and this is where we get some real nuances happening, because at this point, all of the states are now, they're kind of like the size of countries these days, right? Like the way that how independent they really are and how much identity there is with an individual state. We don't experience that now. We don't experience now the type of, not just like, oh, Texas pride, or hey, I'm from California, therefore we're a little bit more relaxed, or I'm from New York, so you're a little bit more, one way or the other. The South kind of has that. The Midwest kind of has that. It kind of, but only in kind of culture. the states were full powers, full entities, really, really powerful individually, and therefore their interpretation of what the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution meant was very vastly different. The way that people would, the way that states would allow things like particularly slavery, and so it became a real big conflict for a family who had been trying to get rid of it for generations, like the Lees, who'd been trying to say, like, okay, I get it, guys, let's try to, like, okay, we got independence, now here's the Constitution, come on. And then we've got the Missouri Compromise. Can this go away? And it's almost like we needed in order for it to really go away, it needed to be paid for with blood. It needed to be paid for by it needed to be just bled out.
Right.
And so now we get to Robert E. Lee, I think, which is where the conversation becomes very interesting. Tell us a little bit about Robert E. Lee and his decisions to join the Confederacy. What happens here?
Well, and this actually gets right back to the stories that I heard as a child, which I've then now researched and have tempered a little bit. But basically what I was told was, well, Robert E. Lee was a Virginian. The Lees were Virginians, and Virginia was succeeding with the Confederacy. And Robert E. Lee, the leader of the U.S. military, the U.S. Army, he was the leader of the U.S. military. He has a decision to make because, so it looks like there's going to be a conflict. He's a Virginian, but Lincoln's kind of counting on him to lead the what we would as the Union forces against the Confederates. That's a problem, right? So the story I heard was, and I've researched this, and I think it's generally true. He spent all night, one night, pacing the floor, Stratford Hall, trying to figure out what he's going to do. Like the classic sleepless night. Like, don't even get in bed. Like, walking the floor, figuring it out, comes to the conclusion in the morning, I'm a Virginian. My family is the founding family of Virginia. We are Virginians. I got to stay with Virginia. And so he put in his resignation to Lincoln, and was then asked by President I just forgot his name, and the Confederacy
Jefferson Davis.
To lead the Confederate forces. And that decision, by the way, some have argued that decision was the difference between the conflict being something that lasted a matter of months and a war that lasted a matter of years. That single decision, because he was so respected and people followed him, right? And he stayed, with the U.S. forces, what we call the Union. It's argued that many other people would have stayed with him as well, and et cetera. So it's a big deal. But to get the point is the one you made earlier, which is that people thought of themselves back then as the state that they're from. I'm a Virginian. I'm a Carolinian. I'm from a Marylander. People identified with their state, and families generally did. Now, of course, we know some families were split during the Civil War, and you did have sort of brother fighting brother, if you will, which was obviously very painful, because again, these personal views were different about liberty and about states' rights versus the federal government, and about slavery and abolition, and so these things came into play. But at the end of the day, if you look at it from a leadership level, Robert E. Lee had a tremendous amount to do with what we now know as the Civil War being the Civil War. And I think it's very interesting as well, by the way, a little side note, that is something, Eddie, you've made me aware of, and I went and looked it up, and it's true. A couple of months before the Gettysburg Address, Lee freed his enslaved people. Mm-hmm. He just, I don't know all the reasons, right? But he's you're free, you go, and so again, there's those personal views, those personal beliefs and loyalties, and are all throughout the Civil War, and really the issue of slavery, and the issue of kind of what kind of a nation are we, and where are we headed.
Well, I think that's exactly kind of why we started the podcast and started really talking, is because every few generations, whether it's 2.5 or really every so often there is a challenge of the day that will ask us to, question in a new way our commitment to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, our commitment to those principles of inalienable rights. And so I can only imagine Robert E. Lee saying, "Yeah, well, you know what? I think we should, manuscript those enslaved people on our estate, and do that of our own volition, right?" And so, I see that Robert E. Lee making that decision to do that on his own, rather than instead of waiting for, and yet still fighting for what I see with Robert E. Lee is that he's fighting with his family and with his heritage.
Yes.
But I see, as a country, I see, well, who else would it have been, right? Who else would have known when to stop, right?
Yes. Yes.
Who else would have said, okay, this is far enough, and we're not going to go any further? And then who else would the country have listened to say, I'm glad he's the one who made the decision? Because, as you said, Robert E. Lee was the commanding general for all of he was the highest ranking officer in that the government had, right? That we all had. He was the graduate of West Point. In fact, this is one of the nuances that I kind of realized, is that when we lost Virginia, when Virginia went to the South, we also lost West Point, right? So West Point went to this. Do I have that right? West Point went to the South?
No, West Point's in New York. So no, not West Point. So no, it wasn't West Point, but it was fair to say that a lot of military leadership was lost from the Union or the Confederate, and it had a lot to do with what happened in the battles and such, which was obviously brutal. But the point you're getting at, I think, is an important one, which is that here is a man whose family is a founding family of the country. He knows all that history, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is very, 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 very cognizant of that, right? So even though he chose to fight as a Virginian with the Confederacy, it's not lost on him the larger picture here historically.
Well, at the same time,
as the conflict, right? Yeah.
I'm just gonna say, at the same time, what's the Union asking him to do? Shoot at his own house?
It gets rather crazy, right? Yeah.
How
are you gonna do that? Right? Yeah.
What am I gonna do? Shoot at my own house? Like what? No, like. But the thing about it is like he had been, as far as I understand, in Virginia, he had been advocating for abolitionism, but at the same time, like, he's not in charge of that. Like, he's not a representative. He was in the military, so he's not politically there. The state of Virginia is seceding, and he can't control that. Right.
No,
and so it's almost kind of like, go ahead.
Yeah, but we can control those. Sorry, but I'm going to get back to the point you made earlier that I kind of exclaimed on so strongly, was knowing when to stop. So there's an excellent book I recommend everybody read. And you think I'm crazy to tell you that there's this exciting history book. Like, doesn't that sound like an oxymoron? Yeah. Exciting history book called April 1865. Mm-hmm. And it's about what happened day by day, and it actually goes a little broader than just the month of April. But what happened was day by day in the leading up to the end of the Civil War. And that month of April 1865 is fascinating. And one of the things that's fascinating about it is that without discussion, Lee and Grant and Lincoln were actually of the same mind about what had to happen as the war was coming to a close, that there had to be an ending of putting down arms and going back to homes, and no punishing, no flogging, no imprisoning, no taking it out. We're the victors. We're gonna, no, lay down your arms, because they all, in their own way, understood this is about the country. The country, we're still a country, and if this is over, which it did end at Appomattox, right? Mm-hmm. That then, therefore, we're all Americans, and it's got to, and I got to believe that Lee was drawing on his place in the family, Lee family, and his understanding of all that, which allowed him to accept that, and not be a firebrand, not be a terrorist, not be out there continuing to fight,
Right.
encouraging skirmishes and all that. That he could have, right? We take it for granted. Then the book makes this point. We take it for granted that the war just ended just on this one day so peacefully. Didn't have to end that way. This was a brutal conflict.
Yep.
It could have been awful, right?
Right.
But the leadership of the country, Lee, Lincoln, and Grant,
Mm-hmm.
were of the same mind, and they set the example. Their leadership and their courage set the example, and people followed their example. And in fact, there was no punishing going on. And so then Lee literally went back home, and Stratford was lost at that point, and moved into a row house in Richmond, and led a quiet life essentially, not encouraging conflict, and not encouraging argument, and wanting the nation to heal. And to me, that was huge. To me, it was really huge, and it shows that he remained throughout loyal to the ideals that his family had always represented and fought for, and that is something we just take for granted, but it is significant. It is very significant.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of where my head's at with it, as well as I've done the studying that I've done, and I know there's so many more who've done so much more, but it's not that the Union wins, right, and federalism and control wins, but rather America wins, right, and our nation now is it's the Civil War that allows our nation to be one nation under God. So it's during the Gettysburg Address where Abraham Lincoln says, "Fourscore and 7 years ago, our forefathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." He's talking about Lee's. He's talking about Richard Henry Lee. He's talking about the Lee family, and then he talks about Gettysburg and the destruction that's happened on that, and then in the end he says, "This nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom." So, but under God was not in his original text. He said it. He just knew that that's what was going to happen, and it's at that point, and that's the first time in our history that we looked at all of our individual states, not just united, but now as one nation. But in order to be one nation, we couldn't be one nation under federalism. The states had to be able to say, "I'm not just stopping the war because I want the war to end and because I've lost, but because I accept that freedom for all. I accept the tenets, the proposition that all men are created equal." And that we all have that, and and we don't need to do the slavery thing anymore. It's done, right? We're going to pay for that with our blood, and this is enough. And I don't know, just kind of from a spiritual perspective, I don't know if there was anybody else, like I said, that the South would have listened to if when the general said, "We're done, like this is as far, we're not going to destroy." Plenty of people in the
South, who didn't agree. I mean, who
Right.
didn't see it that way, right? Plenty, just because the designing Appomattox and we surrender, that didn't change people's hearts, right? Down
Right.
in Florida, and so but you're right. But they looked at Lee, and it took about a month for the word to get out down into the out to the countryside, and the skirmishes to end, and all the rest. But it's because Lee led that and said that this is how it's going to be. So essentially, his actions were very consistent with the Gettysburg Address. I mean, that's what we're saying here.
Right. Uh-huh.
Without him having to quote it and do a speech about it and all the rest.
Right.
Because his actions spoke louder than his words because of who he was and who his family was. And that's why I think it's so significant that Stratford Hall has been restored. And we can go to Stratford Hall and see all that, because it really is the foundation of everything that we're talking about is there, like I said, there and Mount Vernon and Monticello. These are places where you can physically take your family and see a family home that is part of everything that we're talking about. It kind of brings it to life. And you see the personalities and the differences and the flaws and all the rest. And it really shows that this is how this country was formed. But the forming of a country is not as this smooth thing.
Yeah,
we've proved it, right?
Well, we don't have angels on the planet, right?
No, and our Canadian friends would say they had their own crazy road, right? And they've had their own
right.
issues. And Mexico's had its own issues. I mean, this is just how it is.
Yeah.
And what it comes down to in every country is the leadership exhibited by certain individuals, usually part of large families that show other families that this is what it means to be a citizen of
Right.
this new country.
Right.
Yeah.
I look at the full Lee. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to mention you brought up something. You said it took the families, right? And the families are what people are listening to. This is falling off for some reason. But just to bring it back to the point that it takes families to build a nation. It wasn't the government that built America. It was the families who were in Congress. It's the families who were willing to stand up for what we believe in that built our nation today, and built all the other ones, of course. But that's where we stem from, is from the families that God created and formed.
Well, I think as well, like with Robert E. Lee, it would have been very different if he hadn't had that history, that family history. If he didn't know his history, I mean, pacing the floor all night long, going, I wish we were a nation. Like, I wish we were one nation right now, but we're not. There's all these different states that do different things, and it's not within my power to change what Virginia's going to do. And if I have to go on the other side, I'm going to be shooting at my own house. Like, besides but I know that my family believes in these principles. And, even as you said before, even Robert E. Lee manuscripts or otherwise, emancipates his own slaves before the Gettysburg Address. And so it's not like these people were like trying to hold on to some evil that they couldn't get rid of or anything. But it takes more than that. I see I kind of see the whole Lee family story kind of like the way that we interpret David in the Bible, where between David and Bathsheba. So if we only looked at the bad parts of David, then nobody would ever read Psalms, first of all. Right. But then as well, right, we wouldn't actually enjoy the scriptures. But then as well, between David and Bathsheba, not in the first instance, but after their marriage, we get Solomon. Right. We get King Solomon. And so it's like, yeah, guys, the road is bumpy. Like, the road is bumpy. It's awkward. It's not always smooth. It's not always easy.
And we're not always perfect in any means.
Right. We're not angels, yet. So we can't expect that. But what we can do is look at what we have, look at the good things and emulate the good things that we need. Are you still with me?
That was weird.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, my screen just went, for a second.
No, still here.
So
I'm thinking, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the families that were destroyed during the war, that were torn apart.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's tragic, right? Tragic. It weakened our country.
Absolutely.
You need to acknowledge that.
Uh-huh.
This is why we can never have another civil war, because it can only hurt us as a country. We have to figure out how to preserve democracy,
Right.
and preserve states' rights, and preserve having a strong government, federal government, because God knows in this crazy world we live in, we better have a strong military, we better have a strong sense of country to make it, right? So all these things that have to happen. And these were all issues that were in different ways dealt with at the formation of the country. We're still dealing with them now, just in different circumstances and different ways. But it does, at the end of the day, come down to, in your family, you've got to teach your children these things the way it was shared with me around the dinner table. Teach your children about these principles, because that allows us to have a foundation, so then we go out into the world and deal with these questions, which are thorny questions and issues, and we're making our decisions about what we're going to do politically and socially and morally and all the rest. We have some foundation, both historical and moral, and that's really, really important. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Society of Leaders of Virginia, which I'm a lifetime member of, is become over the years more important to me. When my grandmother first told me, "Oh yeah, I've made you a lifetime member of the Society of Leaders of Virginia," I was like 15 years old, and I was like, what does that mean? Like, it didn't mean anything to me, right? Well, today it means a lot, because this is the family that I come from that had a lot to do with with the country when where I was founded. But then also today, what does it mean? Well, we're cousins, we're far-flung cousins, and from different walks of life and all different professions and backgrounds, and we can come together with this shared heritage. And any family that can figure out how to do that in their own way is brings strength and courage and a foundation for that next generation to build on, to call on as they're moving the country forward. And maybe I'm getting too esoteric here, but I think it's not too far flung to say that when people don't have a sense of their family history, when they feel cut off or where they come from is really not known, I think it puts that individual at somewhat of a disadvantage to figure out how to operate in this world this crazy world that we live in, and figure out where they fit into our country and deal with these issues of the day that affect where the country's when we're going to go. So these things are important. That's why we're talking about this today.
Well, that's exactly, you're spot on, Steve, because we have a couple sayings with it, and that's God makes families, families make nations, but your family history is American history, and that's exactly why what I think this conversation is all about is encouraging families to be courageous in peace. We've already had a civil war; we don't need another one. And in that Civil War, we bled out slavery. We got that, but we also found what the other aspects of that Civil War were over federalism, over control. That liberty comes from God, and it wasn't until Abraham Lincoln we didn't win. The Union didn't win because they had military might. They won because they came to God's side. They invited God into their purpose, right? And they knew that what Richard Henry Lee declared as part of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, and that we have certain inalienable rights. And Robert E. Lee knew that, and once that changed, then I think that's where the war changed, and that's where things started to develop into the Union's favor. And it wasn't until we're watching a bunch of different movies and studying a lot of different things all at the same time about where families were, what type of attitudes families had on the Confederacy side, on the Union side. The North, certainly, just because it was the North, it didn't mean that they didn't have slavery there, and it didn't mean that they didn't have all sorts of different issues as well. Just a quick case in point, in Abraham Lincoln's second term, there was a lot in the North that didn't like him because he won by a plurality. He didn't win by popularity. There were two people running. There were two other presidential candidates, and so he didn't win because he was just so popular, right? He won by a plurality, and so what that meant was there was a lot of people even in the North that didn't want him to, that didn't like him, and so yep. And they were basically slave states, and but they were kind of landlocked, and there were people simultaneously. There were people in the South that were free states, but they were landlocked. So you have, like the Free State of Jones, which is in Alabama, which is a county that says we're not for the slavery thing. We're done. Of course, Virginia splits during the Civil War, and I my heart goes out to Robert E. Lee because he says, "Hey, I'm a Virginian." But then after the war begins and it starts to develop, Virginia becomes Virginia and West Virginia, and so it becomes two completely different states over that issue. And so a lot of the counties move and become their own state, and then lots of other, some states are formed differently. Here in Tennessee is very interesting because we were talking about families, brother against brother, and it really shows that here in Tennessee, because the Civil War history here is they had three different votes for secession, because there's kind of three buckets of Civil War history. There's the secession, there's there's the war, and then there's abolitionism, right? Slavery, non-slavery. And in Tennessee, there's they had three different sessions to vote on secession. So it's kind of a bit of a mouthful, but the first session they had to vote on secession. The way that it worked is Tennessee has three parts to it. And I apologize for being complicated, but it's actually kind of nuanced. So Tennessee has East, Middle, and West Tennessee. So East Tennessee did not want to secede from the Union. They did not want to participate in the Civil War, and they were for abolitionism. So they did not want slavery. West Tennessee, the Memphis side of Tennessee is Mississippi River stuff. And so they wanted secession, they wanted the Civil War, and they wanted to allow slavery to proliferate and to continue to go. Middle Tennessee, however, was right in the middle of both of those. And so when the first vote, they cast out all three sections of the state. And East Tennessee 9-1 was against slavery, against war, and against secession. The complete opposite was in West Tennessee. But in Middle Tennessee, in the first vote, they have it's about 5-4. Like, what is it? It's like 7 to 3. It's like 5-4. Yeah, it was 5-4, 6-4. I apologize. It's really razor thin for staying in the Union. And then they vote again, and it's the same result. And the third time they vote, it's Middle Tennessee that flips, but it just barely flips. And it's only because after General Grant fires on Fort Sumter to quench a rebellion, right? And that's when Middle Tennesseans saw that the federal government was it wasn't so much about slavery, but that flipped the whole state. Now, what's interesting is in Tennessee, Tennessee lived up to its name of being the volunteer state, because there was more volunteers leaving the state of Tennessee and joining the Union. So it was a Confederate state, joined the Union, than any other state in the Confederacy. And so it's interesting to see that when you get into the Civil War and you get into that history, you actually see that there's in Tennessee there's this brother against brother, family against family, because their state is literally split. Right, East Tennessee petitioned to Nashville multiple times, saying, "Hey, we're not part of this Confederacy. We don't want to do this." And so, the war that was fought here was fought against East Tennessee. So, General Lee had a lot to deal with, saying, "Well, guys, your states don't even want this. Like, people in your own states don't. Okay, well, we're gonna have to keep them in line. They're gonna." So they were fighting even their own people to stay in line in that cause, and it was just kind of a never ending. They were tripping over themselves all the time, and so there was notions of this is a rich man's war, and like we don't want to do this. Sorry for being so long winded about it, but I think that really paints the picture for the nuances that occur with it. And so there's literally family against family, or brother against brother in those circumstances.
And some of those volunteers probably died at Gettysburg, right?
Yeah, right.
And so then you have the Gettysburg Address, which I think you kind of wrap this up here. You really pointed to the key that the language in the Gettysburg Address is the thing that ties the future of the country to the past of the country. And that's what makes now we can honestly say, looking back, why the address was so important. Why it was important that Abraham Lincoln said, under God, we are a nation. And that summed it up. That's sort of like, that was eventually the solution to everything you're talking about. How do we get past all this? How do we heal this? How do we move forward? It isn't even just about slavery, it's about the healing of the country. The healing started there with that address, and eventually then led to what happened at Appomattox, and Lee walking away, and Grant saying we're not going to punish, and then you go from there. There's a really interesting TV series called Manhunt
Okay,
uh,
that's fun.
that I recommend.
Okay.
And it's very fictional, but it
Uh-huh.
has in it many of the nuances you were talking about earlier
Mm-hmm.
that are occurring in the North, post Civil War, right after the
Mm-hmm.
Civil War, leading up to the assassination of Lincoln, and then what
Mm-hmm.
happened. You can see that depending upon the person
Mm-hmm.
and the family they were from, they had very different views about slavery and about government and about you can it's also all kind of in there,
Right.
the messiness of it even still,
Right.
and so it's just it's this is our history,
Yeah.
and as families we need to know it, and then we need to live it out today as we understand it to be correct, under
Mm-hmm.
God and within the ideals of America.
Right, exactly. So it really boils back down to how our rights come from God, and they're given to all, right?
Yeah,
And everybody has those same rights, and then the family is the one that creates our governments, and it's not governments that create governments.
right.
It's and when that tries to occur, then we go through we stumble, and we
Right.
see that all throughout our history.
And let's not forget the suffragette movement is another example of it, right?
So
We talk about men having this. Well, women didn't have the right to vote. It took us that long, and even if you study the suffragette movement,
mhm,
incredible. Same thing. The same dynamics are going on. Leaders who, yeah, I believe, yeah, you should have the right to vote,
mhm,
but but they
mhm,
didn't make it happen. Eventually they have to fight, right, in their own way. It wasn't a war, but they had to
right.
fight to get the right to vote. It's just taken us as a country all this time to get to
Mhm,
to make real what you're saying, that God gives us these rights, but as human beings, we often, because we're imperfect and country's not perfect, we fight, we struggle to
mhm.
make all of that liberty and freedom a reality, and it's not easy. It's not easy
I'm really glad you brought that up. I didn't expect to go in this direction, but I'm really
to
glad you
to
brought that
keep
up.
it and to keep,
Yeah, I'm glad you
yeah,
brought that up because
yeah, I
June.
think
There's a lot that happens in June. Yeah, there's a little bit of a delay there. I'm sorry about that. There's a lot that happens in June and in our nation. And in 1919 in June we signed the was it the what I'm gonna we signed the amendment that gave the women the right to vote. That it's not that it gave it, and this is one of the things that's about amendments, is that it clarifies all that it's supposed to mean, right? And so you have to write it down because some places in the nation were not participating in that. On the other hand, some places in the nation were, and it's the same thing with women the right to vote and with slavery. It's like, okay, guys, we can't come up with every way that you're going to misinterpret that all men are created equal, and that means everybody, okay?
yeah,
And
So
that means
and
now.
that means now
right.
exactly. So it's not it doesn't mean so the amendments are like, oh, we gave it to you like you were supposed to have, like, no, it was already there. It's just some people just weren't getting it. And so
Right.
but the Lee family for it's been a real exciting time for us in our household, because we've been able to dive into the Lee family and the heritage, and really understanding, like, one family at a time. There are families that one family at a time we change our nation. And the Lees, as you were saying before, the Lees and the Washingtons, the Adams, the Jeffersons, they all knew each other. They all participated with each other. In fact, Robert E. Lee, his wife was a Custis, so that means that she was related to Martha Washington. And when we do our own family history, we can see who we're related to, and understand that, okay, the criticality that I put toward these people is like putting the criticality toward my own mother, right? Like, why would I? Let me understand where they were coming from, what time they lived in, what were they up against, what was going on, and how much courage and light they needed in order to make the changes that they made, rather than criticize and say it wasn't enough, right? Or it was, we should erase that from history because it's not good. We should be ashamed of it. But rather, understanding that the light that comes from the courage to make changes. So
in your own time, whatever that is.
well, you know what? And I didn't get a chance to really bring this one up, but you're absolutely right. Like, I think the Lee family, the whole heritage of the Lee family is they know what time it is, right?
Yep.
They know what time it is. It's very easy for any of the Lees to say, whether it's Richard Henry Lee, to say, hey, why would I need to, we don't need to do that. We're going to wait for somebody else to do that. Or Robert E. Lee to recognize that, like, yeah, perhaps he's the only person. I don't know if he really understood that perhaps he was the only one that would be able to do that, and then really call it done and have that be enough, right? I don't know if he really understood it to be like that, but
no, he knew. I'm sure he did. The leader. He was the leader of. I mean, this
Right.
is what it means to lead, right? This is what it
Right.
means to lead. You're right. In the moment, this is right now. I need to do this.
Right.
And we face this in our own personal lives sometimes. Don't look to somebody else to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Do the right thing even when no one's looking. Because it's about you in that moment doing what you believe based on your values and your family and your history. Do the right thing because you're making history. We're all making history every day, actually. It's just most of it isn't recorded, right? Most of it isn't.
Yep.
But things happen, and it makes a difference when we individually and do the right thing. Then collectively, we end up going in the right direction. And
Absolutely.
that's just simplistic. It sounds simplistic when you say it that way, but
Not at all, Steve. Not at all, Steve. I think that's.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think with that, we can say, our blessings of liberty come because of courageous families like the Lees who pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honors to preserve the liberty of the next generation, even in harsh opposition, in tough times. They knew what time it was. They knew what they needed to do, what they could do. And they did, and they paid their pledge truly, their lives, their fortunes, and sacred honors. And so they joined those who have come before us, such as Bradford, Jefferson, Lincoln, Lee, Eisenhower. There's so much good to look to, and we from the Lee heritage and family, and we really appreciate Steve. We really appreciate you being with us today, sharing your family history, the heritage, the stories. I really appreciate your candor and the love that you have for American history, for your history. And we hope that we can join you. I hope you can join us again. I'm sure there's been a lot of questions and comments that have been going, and we look forward to speaking with you again. So is there anything else you'd like to mention?
No, thank you. This has been a great experience. I'm honored to be able to be here and to speak. I'm not a historian. You guys already figured that out, right? I'm not a historian. I'm a member of a family that just happens to be a very famous family in America. And I'm just thank you for the time and the dialogue. And this process of us putting this together, I've learned a lot. It's really caused me to take even a deeper interest in my own family. And I've got a whole box in the garage of books and charts, and I'm gonna go through that now with renewed interest and see what more I can learn and get myself to an annual meeting of the Society of Lees of Virginia, just because that's just the next step in my own evolution as a member of the family. So you've inspired me to take those next steps. So thank you.
Well, yeah. Steve, it's really been our pleasure. It really has been. And looking at, looking at the history and the heritage of the Lees, we wouldn't be able to have a country without the Lees, from what I can see. Just like everybody, the Lee family is definitely one to be revered, one to be looked at, one to be emulated. So we appreciate you.
Yeah, it's definitely.
Thank you, Jen.
Oh, thank you for your time. The Lee family has definitely been a pivotal family in the founding of our nation, and we're so grateful that we were able to have you with us today to be able to represent that side of the family. And I think that's amazing. And we hope, as an audience, that you guys are all invigorated to go research your own family history and find the true stories that were placed before you. Your family came from somewhere. There's a lot of courage behind you. Go find their playbook, because that is how we make it through today, and that is what our nation is founded on. They knew that we needed our freedoms and our beliefs and our religious freedom from persecution. That's why we're here. That's what we're standing for. That's what we're continuing to fight for. So we hope that we have invigorated everyone else to continue with the fight and find where their courage comes from.
Right. Guys, the compact on your wall really invokes all of those things. So we have, for those who don't know, we have a great fun family experience. Something that you can jump online. You can get it at undergodproject.com. There's a whole bunch of new stuff in the shop that can really invite God into our national identity. I make these by hand, and so I have a screen printer. Which one is that one? Is it that one?
What are you trying to do?
No, the screen printing thing.
Oh, the making it.
Yeah, where did it
Sorry.
go? There it is. Yeah, so I'll use real ink, squeeze it out, all that stuff. But what's interesting? Great. Yeah, it's really a lot of fun. So, it's a big compact that goes on the wall. The family has the opportunity to sign. You guys get feather pens and all that other fun stuff. The seal, we've added this since we started it, but the seal, and I don't think we have a video for it, but the seal is made by other compacting families. And so we'll announce a little bit more stuff. We've got some new announcements to make about how that can work. And make it a little bit more accessible, etc. But anyway, so let's close it up with that. Thank you again, Steve. Thank you so much, Steve. We really appreciate your time.
We are so glad that you guys were all here with us today. Thank you again for your time. And as always, may God bless you.
May God bless this America, or may God bless America.
There you go. May God bless this American family. Have a great night.
Everyone, guys. We're tripping over it. We're tripping over our outro. There's only one button that I'm supposed to press for this thing. Hang on. Let's start over. We're going to do that. Okay. We're going to do our outro again.
It's not bad.
Okay, ready, set,
go.